electricity training forum. We are excited to hold this unique training for you all and look forward to what's hopefully a valuable training to better understand real-time and day-ahead markets. Before we kick off today's day one session, I'd like to orient all the participants on what to expect over the next 2 weeks. So as you all probably saw on the agenda, it's a 3-part training series. And today's training will be provided by the California ISO. And the objective of today's training will be to explore bidding in the day-ahead market, as well as the real-time bidding process, and then potential market outcomes and results from those processes. And then the next 2 sessions will be held next Thursday and Friday, October 27th and 28th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Mountain Time. Professors Frank Wolick and Mark Thurber from Stanford will be joining us and providing hands-on simulation where you will work in teams to play the role of generating companies bidding into the market. So similar to the basic training most of you attended previously, except this time we'll be focusing more on day-ahead functions. We will be sending you all an email early next week to provide details on next week's session, specifically your assigned teams, and then the details on the breakout rooms and how that will all work. So thank you again for joining, and we hope you enjoy the training. I'll now hand it over to Radha at the California ISO to begin day one's session.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Radha Madrigal, and I'm one of the lead client trainers here at the California ISO. And as Bonnie said, we'll be taking you through some day-ahead market bidding examples, real-time market. We'll talk about potential market outcomes. There's also a little section in the middle where we talk about some of the nuances in transitioning from day-ahead into real-time. I also have with me Rochelle Wiltsius, who is going to be my producer for this session. She'll be helping me manage the question and answers and making sure that everybody is getting there, mainly helping me make sure I see folks who have raised their hands and looked at questions in the chat. So we'll have, I'm hoping, a very interactive session where you have the opportunity to ask questions that you might have. In these examples, we've built in plenty of time for you to ask questions and get more clarity about these examples. So as we go through the session, then I'll kind of kick it off. Actually, maybe let me just do this and share my screen with you so we can get going here. I don't know, Rochelle, if you wanted to say a word or two or no.
Thanks, Radha. I just wanted to welcome everyone. We're very excited to be able to provide kind of a second session of how the ISO markets work. As Radha mentioned, I'm just going to be in the background here today helping her manage any kind of questions that you guys have. And she'll talk more about how you can ask your questions a little bit later on in the presentation, but please feel free to ping me directly if you're having any issues with the WebEx. I'm here to assist. Back to you, Radha.
Thanks so much. All right, I'll go ahead and start the presentation and share the slides here. All right, so as I mentioned, this is California ISO market transactions, and we're going to be going through a number of examples. Here in the WebEx platform, we ask that you keep yourself muted throughout the session to minimize background noise, but we do want you to be able to ask your questions whenever you would like, as they kind of form and pop up. So you can unmute yourself to ask verbal questions, you can put questions in the little chat panel, or you can raise your hand by clicking on the little hand raise icon, and we can call on you as the session progresses. So that's how we intend to kind of traverse through the material today. One item of note, if you want to ask a question, if you could make sure that when you put that into the session, that you ask questions to everyone, and I actually need to double check real fast here that I have given you the ability. Hold on a second. look here real fast. Yeah, okay, I allowed you to chat with everyone. Okay, good. So when you put questions into the chat pod, if you can make sure that they're addressed to everyone, that way everyone can see what we're looking at. And as Rochelle said, if you have questions, technical issues, or need further clarification about something, you could send her a quick note. You could send it to everyone, and we'll make sure that we get all those questions answered throughout the session here. So that's how it will work. From a timing perspective, I plan to take a break at about 5 minutes to the top of each hour. So at 9:55, we'll take a 5-minute break, and then again at 10:55, and then our last portion of the session will go until noon, and then end. And we'll kind of gauge how everything works based on the questions that you have. Here is a quick overview of how we plan to, or the material that we plan to go through. So first, we'll talk a little bit about participating in the ISO market, and then we'll quickly dive into the examples about bidding into the day-ahead market. We have a section where I'll point out a couple of things to keep in mind when transitioning from day-ahead to real-time, and then we have a couple of real-time examples to go through. As Bonnie indicated, the focus is going to be on the day-ahead market, but we have 2 real-time market examples that we'll talk through. And then we'll wrap it up with a discussion about other potential market outcomes. And what I mean by that is you will see that in my examples, we put bids in, they get accepted, and then we move forward. But we have an opportunity to discuss other things that might happen, such as bids not getting accepted and why that might occur. And we'll wrap up the session with a discussion about that. We've got these course slides. They should be posted on the website for you. And we've got a couple of learning activities that we'll go through. Primarily, today's session is going to be focused on discussion and making sure you have your questions answered. The goal is to set a really good foundation for you as you work through the examples with the Stanford team next week. All right. For the course objectives, again, we're going to be exploring day-ahead and real-time bidding processes and then looking at potential market outcomes. So first, I wanted to tee it off with just a short discussion about participating in the ISO market. Depending on the service that you will be providing will determine the way in which or the manner in which you participate in the ISO market. You could be a convergence or a virtual bidder. You could be a generator, a load serving entity, a demand response provider. You could be a participant in the WEIM footprint, or you could be many of these. In any of these cases, you need to either be a scheduling coordinator or use or hire the services of a scheduling coordinator. The scheduling coordinators are the only folks that are actually bidding into the ISO market. So they are the ones submitting those bids, and then the market clears on the day of the energy flows across the transmission system through the distribution system of the local utilities, and then down to the end use customer. So we will focus on primarily the day ahead market and bidding into that. For those of you that were with us in June, when we went through a high level of the day ahead market process, here we're going to focus very specifically on bid information. We also have a day ahead market process called residual unit commitment. We'll talk a little bit about that. But the main focus is getting those energy and capacity schedules. So the bidding activities that drives the market results. And then we'll talk through from the lens of a variety of different participants. We'll take a look at that. This diagram here is going to essentially be a high-level picture for you of everything that we're going to be discussing today. First, we'll talk about the day-ahead market and the timeline that goes along with that, and then we'll talk about how those results feed into the real-time market. So we'll see this slide 2 times. First time here to kick off the day-ahead section. So just to orient you a little bit with regard to timing, the day-ahead market opens 7 days before the actual trade date or the day that the energy flows. And then it closes at 10 a.m. the day before. So right now it is 9/11 Pacific time. So that means the day ahead market for tomorrow's trade date, which would be October 20th, that market closes at 10 a.m. this morning. So the examples that we're going through are going to be what folks are actually doing right now. And then those market results get published at about 1300 this afternoon. When the day ahead market results get published, that is what triggers the opening of the real-time market. And then that real-time market is open from that point up until 75 minutes before the top of each individual trade hour for real-time. So that's a little bit about how the timing plays. And we're going to go ahead and walk through a little bit of what happens after the market closes at 10 a.m. It may be a refresher for those of you that were with us in June, or something new for those of you that are just joining us and didn't participate in the June session. All right, so the day ahead market has 3 processes. The first is what we call market power mitigation. In this process, they look at all of the bids that have, and when I say here, what I'm saying is they or we, what I really mean is the market software or the market engine. So these aren't individual ISO operators that are looking at bids, but the ISO market or the ISO software, the algorithms, the calculations that are being done. I'll walk you through the processes for each one of those. So market power mitigation, bids are submitted, the market closes at 10 a.m. And then the first thing that is done is an analysis of those bids that have been submitted to make sure that if there is any participant that has the potential for market power, that market power gets mitigated. Market power would be defined as essentially my ability to control the price based on where I may be located. So if I am, let's say, the only generator that can serve our particular load pocket, technically I could submit really high bids and have to be awarded by the market because I'm the only resource that's able to provide energy to that area. So there are a series of calculations that are done to determine if any of these bidders have the potential for market power. And if so, by a variety of tests and checks, we do something called mitigation, where we take the bid that they submitted and lower it to what we call the default energy bid. Now, that default energy bid is something that would have been organized ahead of time and pre-selected. There's about 6 different varieties of ways that the default energy bid can be calculated. And if you have the potential for market power, your bid may be mitigated or lowered to that default number prior to that set of bids being analyzed for the market by the market. Think of it as a check for competitiveness. The goal is to make sure that each of the what we call constraints or specific areas in the grid marked by different transmission lines and a collection of generators in that particular area, that all of those are competitive constraints. And so the first thing that we do is we check in this run called market power mitigation to look to see if there are any bids that need to be mitigated. And then the next thing that we do is we pass along what we call a clean set of bids to the next process in order for that to run. Now, before I talk about the next process, I think this would be a good opportunity, since it's pretty much the only time we're going to talk about these market processes separate from the bidding activity. I wanted just to check in to see if anybody has any questions that they'd like to clear up about how the market power mitigation process works. Are there any questions?
Rada, we have one question, a hand up from Mariah Benson. Mariah, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering, market participants who submit bids that continually need to be made, is there any
I'm sorry, Mariah. I'm going to raise the volume here. I'm having difficulty hearing you. All right.
I was wondering if for market participants who continually submit bids that need mitigated, if there's any sort of enforcement action against them, or if this is or anything like that. Or if this is...
So I missed that last part. I'm having difficulty hearing you.
I'll throw it in the
Is
chat.
there or
I'll throw it in the chat.
okay, thanks.
All right, Rob, it looks like we have no questions in the chat. And as soon as Mariah's question shows up in the chat, I will read that out.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll move on to discussing the next process while we wait for, no rush, Mariah, but while we wait for her to type in the answer or the question that she's got. For some reason, your audio sounds quite far away. All right, the next process. So we get a clean set of bids from the market power mitigation process. So I think I just saw something pop up. Rochelle, do you want to read that out?
Absolutely. So do market participants that continually submit bids that require mitigation suffer any consequences, or is this a fairly normal process?
Okay, thanks for that. I would say that I've lost track of the percentages, to be completely honest. It does happen on a regular basis, not necessarily with one set of participants continuously, but there are definitely bids that get mitigated both in the day-ahead market process and in the real-time market process. There aren't necessarily consequences because I would say the act of the mitigation itself is what corrects that perception of uncompetitive bids, if you will. So that's why we have that check. We do have, now with that said, we do have a Department of Market Monitoring that monitors participant behavior, and if the bidding patterns of specific participants are something that the Department of Market Monitoring wants to look at further, they may initiate a conversation and ask a question as to why bids are being submitted in such a manner. But separate from that, the actual mitigating or lowering of those initial bids to that default energy bid number is all that happens. So thanks for that question. So once we have a clean set of bids from the market power mitigation process, those get passed on to the next process, which is called the integrated forward market. Now, the integrated forward market is occurring a day in advance. And what's happening there is bids from supply and demand are submitted, and the market runs through and clears those bid-in supply against bid-in supply bids against a bid-in demand, with the goal of clearing as much supply as we can based upon the economic signals submitted by demand participants. The goal of that is to procure both energy and ancillary services in the day-ahead market time frame. And again, the key point about the integrated forward market is we're looking at bid in supply compared to bid in demand. Both of those types of bids are placed on an economic curve. So there will be a supply curve and a demand curve where those two curves intersect. That will determine the market clearing price for each one of those hours in the day ahead time frame, and also will determine how much energy cleared for each hour. Now, before we move past the discussion of the integrated forward market, are there any questions about how that process works before we talk about the next one? I thought I had seen a hand raise and then lower, so I don't know if that was just accidental.
That was me, Bonnie. I was trying to jog my memory about how the default energy bid, but I think I have it now after you've just discussed. So thanks.
Yeah, sure thing. Does anybody have any questions about how the day-ahead integrated forward market process works?
Rhoda, I see no questions in the chat and no hands up.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, so moving on to the next and final process. This is something called residual unit commitment. When we hear the term commitment from the market perspective, it means the market is selecting and determining which resources to turn on or have running for a particular trade date. So residual unit commitment means after we cleared bid in supply against bid in demand, and in that particular process, the integrated forward market, we do have virtual bidding participants in that process. When we get to the residual unit commitment process, we remove the virtual bids from those calculations and look at, from a physical energy perspective, how much physical energy cleared from the supply bids and the demand bids submitted by actual physical participants. I also have, for this particular example, I also have a visual to go along with it to explain how that works. So we'll go over that and then see if anybody has any questions. So the key point here with residual unit commitment is, if we recall from the previous process, the integrated forward market clears bid in supply against bid in demand. Load serving entities will choose to bid in a certain number of megawatts that they anticipate they are going to consume in each of the 24 hours of the coming day. There isn't a requirement that they have to bid 100% of that forecasted consumption, but based on good utility practice, they tend to procure a certain amount of that. Now, the day-ahead market is the only opportunity that load-serving entities have to submit a demand bid, which is essentially a signal that says, I'm willing to purchase this amount of energy for this price. And from a demand, and when we get into our examples about bidding, demand will be the first one that we will talk about. So I'll touch on that in a moment, a little bit more in detail. But at a high level, in the day-ahead market, that's the only opportunity for demand to actually provide an economic signal to say, I'm willing to purchase energy at this particular price. If the price is such and such, I'll buy this many megawatts. If the price is a little bit lower, I'll buy this many more megawatts. So the integrated forward market clears bid in supply against bid in demand. The next process that we move to is called RUC, and from a reliability perspective, the goal of the ISO market is to make sure that we've procured enough energy to meet the load forecast for the coming day. So different from bid in demand, we now take a look at the projected load forecast or demand forecast for the particular trade date. And I'm just going to move a little box out of my vision here. So we take the load forecast and we spread it across what we call the full network model. So we have essentially a computer representation of the physical transmission system. So the full network, it has all of the transmission lines along with all of the generators and where they are located. We have the full network model not only for the ISO balancing area footprint, but the entire WEIM footprint as well. And because the ISO is also a reliability coordinator under the name RC West, we also have the entire West in the full network model as well. So for the day-ahead market currently, which is only the California ISO footprint, we'll spread the demand forecast across all of those different, what we call connectivity loads. There's something called system load distribution factors, a technical or engineering term to determine how we're going to spread that load across the entire system. And the goal is to make sure that we've covered or that we've met the demand for the coming day in each of the 24 hours. There are a separate stack of bids that we look at, which are called RUC bids, which have a different price point. Let me just move this animation forward a little bit. So in the day-ahead market, when you're bidding in for energy, you actually have a bid curve, which says I'm offering X amount of megawatts at this price. If the price is higher, I'll offer a little bit more megawatts, and so forth and so forth. That's on the supply side. On the demand side, it's the reverse. The demand side says I'm willing to procure this many megawatts at this price. If the price is lower, I'm willing to procure more. So we kind of match those two bid curves up to determine the market clearing price and how much energy was cleared in that particular hour. When we get to RUC, we remove any of the virtual bids from that calculation. We look to see the amount of physical energy that cleared, and we look to see what the forecast is for the coming day and the gap that might occur there. We use the RUC process to bridge that gap. So RUC bids are a single quantity and price. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about resource adequacy here because it's simply a state of California thing, but I will mention from the day-ahead market perspective that from a reliability perspective, we have something called resource adequacy in the state of California, which is where load-serving entities are essentially required to contract with suppliers to procure in advance a certain amount of energy to meet their load. Those suppliers of resource adequacy then receive a payment for that capacity and are therefore required to submit bids into this particular process, RUC process, at a price of $0. And kind of the reason behind that is from a financial perspective, they're already getting a resource adequacy payment through the contract for that capacity. So they're not going to get a double payment for just offering that capacity into the market. However, if they are picked up in the real-time market for energy, they will receive that real-time market energy price. So just a small notation here that we have an element in the day-ahead market for the CAISO BA where resource adequacy resources bid into this particular process at $0. So the majority of RUC is procured from these resource adequacy contract resources. Now, from a WEIM perspective, it would be a different construct because you don't have the resource adequacy program necessarily in your individual states. So the market would respect and account for that. But the RUC process, the goal of it, coming out of it, is to make sure that for the coming day, we've procured enough supply to meet the demand forecast in each of the different areas for each one of those 24 hours. That was probably a lot to digest in a short time of the 3 different processes. So here's an opportunity to ask any questions that you have about this particular process, residual unit commitment, or just how the market, the day-ahead market works in general. Does anybody have any questions about RUC?
Hi, Rada. We have a hand up. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. Is it Keisha or go ahead. Keisha, yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I think this is similar to the question that just popped into the chat, trying to understand what you're referring to as virtual bid. And it sounds like that is if the market clears on a place on the supply curve that is different than the actual forecast, it's that difference between the forecast and the cleared bid amount that you're calling a virtual bid. Is that right?
We do have what we call financial participation or virtual bid participation in the market, and I do have an example that will walk through that as well. But essentially, what we call virtual bidding or convergence bidders are financial participants in the market that don't have any physical resource associated with that transaction. They place a bid in the day ahead at a particular location with the goal of trying to figure out how that price will clear in real time. And the difference in day ahead and the real time price is what they're essentially trying to determine. There are virtual bids for supply and virtual bids for demand. And those all line up along the same economic curves along with the physical bids for supply and demand. So yes, the reason why we remove those virtual bids from the RUC calculation is because there is no actual physical energy that will flow based on those virtual bids. So how the market clears in any particular hour could be affected by the amount of either virtual supply or virtual demand bids that were submitted. So there's some nuance there as it relates to the financial implications for those convergence bidders and what costs might be allocated to them. For example, if there were a lot of bids for virtual supply and we ended up clearing a particular hour, some of those megawatts up into that virtual supply category, when we remove those from the calculation, let's say we're going to talk about hour ending 7 just for conversational purposes. Let's say in hour ending 7, we cleared 2,000 megawatts, and then when we remove the virtual bids from that transaction, we actually only have 1,700 megawatts of actual physical supply. So 300 megawatts of that was virtual, and we need to go out and procure 300 megawatts in RUC for virtual to meet that actual physical demand. So part of the RUC calculation will be to go out and get physical supply to meet that demand, and then also allocate some of the costs of procuring that physical supply back to those convergence bidding entities that essentially played a part in determining where that cleared along the economic curve. That's a very high level explanation of how it works, and there's a lot of kind of depth behind that calculation that can be found in some of our other online trainings and some of our market material, but kind of that's essentially how it works at a high level. Does that give you enough to answer your question?
Yes, that was an excellent explanation. Thank you.
Sure thing.
We have another question in the chat. Aiden asks, so is a virtual bid financial rather than physical? He just wants to make sure that he's understanding it.
Yes, absolutely. And so the virtual bids do not have any physical generator associated with that or any physical demand associated with that. They can be submitted by a scheduling coordinator that is only participating in the virtual piece of the market, or you could have load serving entities and physical generating companies that also participate as a convergence bidder as well. But even if I have physical resources, there is never a tie between my virtual transactions and my actual physical fleet of resources. So thanks for those questions. Anything more about RUC or just the market in general, market power mitigation, integrated forward market, or residual unit commitment?
No additional questions here, Rada.
All right, so let's dive into our examples now. The goal there was to kind of give you a feel for how the day-ahead market works and give you some context, and now we'll go through specific examples. We have in the day-ahead time frame, we're going to talk about bids from the perspective of demand, supply. We've got a battery resource that we'll talk about, and we'll also talk about how the virtual or the convergence bids works. So this image that I've drawn up for you here, I've tried to keep it kind of high level. From the perspective of demand, this is a load serving entity. In the day ahead market, they have the ability to submit, and I didn't mention this earlier when we were talking about just the market processes in general, but I'll talk about it here now. We'll be using terms that are called self-schedule, and we'll also be using terms called economic bids. Now, in the ISO market, you have the opportunity on the demand side and on the supply side to submit what we call a self-schedule. Now, a self-schedule means, if I'm talking about the demand perspective, I am going to consume X number of megawatts, and I'm willing to pay whatever the market clearing price is. So in this particular example, they have, and by the way, I'm going to use hour ending 11 as just an hour that we're going to be bidding into for conversational purposes. In the day ahead market, they'll be submitting bids into hour ending 1 through hour ending 24. With daylight savings times, just to give you an idea, when we've got extra time, there's also an extra 25th hour that sometimes occurs. So the market will process every hour for that particular trade date. But for conversational purposes and all of our bids today, we're going to be bidding into hour ending 11. So I'm a demand participant. I'm saying for hour ending 11, I for sure know that I want to at least procure 3,000 megawatts. And then depending on what the price is in the day ahead market, I may be willing to procure additional over and above that. So I submit a 3,000 megawatt self-schedule into the ISO market system, into the bidding tool, and then I layer economic bids on top of that, essentially saying I'm going to buy 3,000 megawatts, whatever the market clearing price is. And over and above that, let's say from 3,000 megawatts to 4,000, if the price is, let's say, $45 or less, I'm willing to buy another 1,000. And let's say from 4,000 to 5,000, if the price is $30 or less, I'm willing to buy an additional 1,000 megawatts. So I, the demand provider or participant, send an economic signal to the market saying, definitely going to buy 3,000, whatever that market clearing price is. And if the price is such and such or less, I'll buy this many megawatts, and such or less, I'll buy this many more, perhaps. So that information gets submitted by 10 a.m. the day before. So right now it's 9:37, so the market will close soon. And then at 1 o'clock this afternoon, I will receive from the ISO market systems my market awards that will tell me how many of my megawatts cleared, and will also tell me what the price is associated with those megawatts. So before I show you an example of what one of those reports might look like, does anybody have any questions about how the bidding process works from a demand perspective?
I don't see any questions, Rada.
Okay. So one point to make here before we take a look at what the day-ahead market results might look like, a reminder that the day-ahead market is the only time that demand is submitting bids on behalf of load-serving entities. And essentially what they're doing is trying to lock in a price for each particular hour. In real time, we will actually use the load forecast for that hour to drive market results. So in this example, and we'll go to what my market results are, so you can get a look at that. So this report is called the Day Ahead Demand Market Results. This is in one of the ISO market systems, and I've kind of simplified the report just to some key details that we're going to be looking at today. So in this example, we've got April 1st as our trade date. We're looking at hour ending 11. When you look at this report, in actuality, it'll have hour ending 1 through 24, but that kind of makes everything really small on the screen. So I've kind of just created a subset of data. So what we see here, if we take a look at, and I'm going to read this report from the bottom row up. So I've got a self-schedule in the schedule type, my self-schedule of 3,000 megawatts that cleared. And I will have another report in the same system that will tell me the price associated with the megawatts for that particular hour. It also shows me the next column or the next row up that I also cleared 2,000 megawatts in the category of market. That means economic bids that were accepted. So my self-schedule of 3,000 plus my additional megawatts up to 2,000 were accepted. So in hour ending 11, I've locked in 5,000 megawatts at whatever this day ahead market price is. Now in real time, because from a demand perspective, I don't have an opportunity to submit any demand bids. Instead, it is the forecast that drives the market to procure energy every 15 minutes and then dispatch that every 5. And we'll talk about that when we get to real time. But from a demand perspective, if I'm looking at hour ending 11, up to 5,000 megawatts, I will have already paid for that consumption at the day ahead market price for hour ending 11. Now in real time, any consumption that I might have over and above the 5,000 megawatts for this particular hour, that will be paid for at whatever the real-time market clearing price is. So from a demand perspective, the load serving entity, their goal is to lock in a price for a certain amount of megawatts in each of the particular hours, and then provide, that price provided that it meets the economic signal that they're sending. In other words, I'm willing to buy this amount of megawatts if the price is such and such or less. To me, that would be a good price and allows me to secure a certain amount of megawatts to meet my load. Going into real time, I know that whatever I consume over and above the 5,000 megawatts for this particular hour, I pay for that at the real-time price. Does anybody have any questions about this demand example before we move on to the next example?
Rada, there are currently no questions in the queue.
All right, so I'm going to move on to the next example, and that will probably take us up to our first break here. So this example is of a supplier submitting day-ahead energy bids and also bids for ancillary services. A couple things that I want to point out here. First, as we build this slide, you'll see some animation flowing in that will add layers to the discussion. So I want to start off just with talking about the resource in general. You'll see some numbers and some terms on the screen. So P-min, or physical minimum, that's the minimum operating capability for this resource that they're able to operate at reliably. So they have to at least be running at 50 megawatts in order to operate this resource reliably. They have a Pmax of 140 megawatts. So I can give you 50 megawatts or up to 140 megawatts with this particular resource. And this is one way this resource may bid into the market. They're submitting a self-schedule of 70 megawatts for energy. Again, a self-schedule indicates that there's no price associated, no economic signal associated with my bid here. So what I'm saying is, from a supplier perspective, I'm going to be generating 70 megawatts in this particular hour, and I'm willing to accept whatever that market clearing price is for that energy production. Now, over and above those 70 megawatts, I'm also going to add or offer my resource economically into the market. So I'm going to layer an additional set of bids for 70 megawatts that brings me to my full 140 megawatt capacity for this resource. I'm also, because I have been certified to provide ancillary services capacity, I'm also going to offer my resource into the market into ancillary services. Now, one thing I want to point out here is if you add up all of the numbers for these megawatts, there's no way that I could get all three of these awards fully because I only have 140 megawatts in this resource. So the market does a co-optimization where it analyzes the bids for energy and for ancillary services to figure out the best way to use this resource in this particular hour. And if I fully award this resource for energy, it means I wouldn't have any megawatts left over to award into ancillary services. And if I give this resource some ancillary services awards, that means I cannot also fully take them for energy. So the market calculates that and figures out the best way to use this resource. In addition, this resource is also submitting a bid of 10 megawatts into RUC, the residual unit commitment process. So those are all the bids they submitted for this resource for that particular hour. And the point with this visual is to have you walk away with a couple of ideas. Number one, the supplier is going to offer their resource into a variety of market products. And the market engine figures out the best way to use this resource across the series of hours. So we're fully optimizing for all 24 hours in the day-ahead market. And then the residual unit commitment process, when the market first clears energy and ancillary services in the integrated forward market process, it then looks at what might be left over for RUC. So depending on how this resource was awarded in the IFM, or that middle process, the integrated forward market, where we are clearing bid-in supply against bid-in demand, that will determine whether or not they have any megawatts left over in that final process, the RUC process. So before I show you what the market results look like, I wanted to give you an opportunity to ask any questions about how a supplier might be bidding into the day-ahead market, maybe some nuances between the variety of products. I also wanted to mention, for conversational purposes, the way I'm showing this supplier bidding in the day-ahead market is if they were participating from the ISO balancing area footprint. When we're talking about the day-ahead market from a larger WEIM participation, the actual balancing area itself is going to be doing what we call self-provision of ancillary services. So there will not be each individual resource that's going to be authoring into ancillary services from the greater extended day-ahead market footprint. Instead, if you are an entity that participates in the day-ahead market, you would bring to the table a calculation of how many ancillary services that entire footprint is going to self-provide. So with that, do we have any questions?
Rada, we have a question in the chat from Mariah. She asks, if enough generation resources provide self-scheduled megawatts in excess of self-scheduled demand, then how is the clearing price determined?
Good question. So the way that we set up each one of these bids on the demand curve and the supply curve is that we kind of, so all of the self-schedules are going to be at zero price. So they come in at the very beginning of the economic curves. And what we find in the market process is there are more self-schedules for demand than there are for supply. So we tend to eat into the supply stack and find an economic price associated with the amount of megawatts that are clearing for that particular hour. So we tend to get more self-schedules from the demand side, meaning I'll buy however many megawatts at whatever the market clearing price is. And we tend to have less self-schedules from the supplier perspective. So the way those curves lined up ends up coming up with a market clearing price for that particular hour. And that's kind of how it's calculated. So I want to say hypothetically, I don't know if we've ever been in a situation where we had enough supply and enough demand all at zero to clear for that particular hour. I don't know if that has happened. I probably need to think about that for a moment and see if we've ever had that happen, or in the event that it does happen, what price would be used. I feel like I need to kind of work through and marinate on that scenario. So let me write that down. I'm not sure that it has happened before, but I think I want to say, what if it did happen? How would we know what price is for that particular hour? So let me get back to you on that particular one. But does the explanation of we tend to have more self-schedules on the demand side versus the supply side, does that kind of make sense for you? Okay, good. All right, so let's take a look at what the results might look like, and we'll walk through those, and then we'll take our first break. So I'm going to kind of read this report a little bit differently, so I'm circling it so that you can see what I'm looking at. First, we'll talk about energy. We'll talk about the self-schedule and then the additional megawatts. So we had a self-schedule of 70 megawatts, and you can see in the column that says self, it's 70 megawatts here. So the self-schedule is picked up. The column that says market has 10 megawatts associated with that. So of the 70 additional megawatts that they offered into the market awarded them an additional 10 megawatts there. So for hour ending 11, this resource has cleared 80 megawatts of energy for that particular hour. The next thing that we're going to take a look at is the ancillary services. So in this particular example, I didn't include in here the self-provision concept But this resource belongs to a load serving entity that is also using it to self-provide ancillary services. So that's part of this calculation as well. So I have 3 megawatts of self-provided ancillary services in addition to the full 40 that I offered into the market. So 43 megawatts of spinning reserve capacity that was awarded as well. And in addition to that, I still had megawatts left over, and this resource was also picked up for RUC. So, so in this particular hour, I have a price for energy, I've got my ancillary services, and I have my RUC award as well. Does anybody have any questions?
We have a question from Bonnie.
I just want to
Yes.
make sure I'm understanding in the extended day ahead market, entities will be able to bid in for ancillary services, right? Or are you just, is this just the California market, but in the future EDM, these products will be available for the market, extended day ahead market?
This example is just a California ISO balancing area example to show you how that works. In the EDAM construct, the balancing authority areas that are participating in EDAM will come in self-providing ancillary services. So there won't be a bidding process to procure ancillary services in EDAM. Each BA will essentially be saying, in this particular hour, we'll be self-providing. We'll be using our internal resources to provide X amount of ancillary services, and there will be a calculation in the market to account for that. So it'll happen a little bit differently for EDAM than the example that I'm laying out for you here.
And do you foresee the California ISO allowing ancillary services to be, like, to create a product for it outside of the ISO, or California rather?
You know, I'm unsure about how this one went through the stakeholder process. I wasn't listening in on those particular discussions. So I truthfully don't know why that particular approach was arrived at. I don't know if it was stakeholder choice or what. I'm not quite sure how we came up with the way that ancillary services are going to be procured. I know that there was discussions on it. So I'm not sure how we arrived at that decision. And I also don't know if it's something that stakeholders want or not. If I were to hypothesize, I would say that if it's something that folks really wanted, it probably would have been baked into the calculation or into the way we decided to do it. So I don't want to further speculate as to why it's not there versus why it might or might not be there in the future. So I would imagine if it's something that stakeholders truly want, that it would be something open for discussion in the future. But like I said, I didn't participate in those discussions, so I'm not sure I don't have a sense of the pulse of what folks are wanting.
All right, Rada, we have a couple of questions in the chat. Mariah's asking, do ancillary services clear at a different price than energy?
Yes, absolutely. So there will be a market clearing price for energy. There'll be prices for the various ancillary services, and then there will also be a separate RUC price. So each of those different products will have a different price associated with it. Their bid caps and bid floors are different as well. And then there was another question, Rochelle?
Yes, from Cameron. So for this particular hypothetical that you have up on your screen for hour ending 11, is the generator dispatched at 133 megawatts? And Cameron lists a little bit of an equation there in the chat, which I won't read out if you wanted to take a look at it, Rada, to give additional context.
Yeah, sure thing. I see that there. And I do have the next slide will talk about what happens in real time. So if we'll just hold on to that for just a moment, we'll talk about how that those awards are set up and then what they end up being dispatched for. But I do want to respect our break time. So it's 9:55. We'll take a quick 5-minute break. We'll come back at 10 o'clock and we'll walk through this example a little bit more, getting into what happens in real time. So we'll be back with you shortly. All right, I am back. That was fast. 5 minute goes quickly. Okay, I'm going to dive right back in. I did want to point out that what you're going to see in these examples is, even though I'm saying that these are day-ahead market examples, I'm actually going to walk you through how all of this works up until real time, just so that you can get the full picture on each individual participant. And then when we get to real time, I'll just have 2 examples of real time, but we'll have already wrapped up how everybody else's market transactions went. So I won't keep you in suspense for how it works. So there were questions about, based on the day ahead results, what does the generator do, or what their dispatches are in real time. So we'll talk through that.
Rada, also, we do have a step prior to the break. I wanted to make sure to address that. Rory, I think, has a question.
For sure, let's do that.
Rory, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, if you are back at your computer, hopefully. Okay, we'll circle back around, Rada.
Okay, great. Let's see. So that image that we're looking at now, the day ahead generation market results, I made a little bit smaller so we can kind of keep them to the side. And the goal is to walk through, based on the activity for this hour or the market results for this hour, what then happens. So what we're going to say is, and let me just move this box so I can see something here. So I'm going to kind of break it out into categories here so we can show you individually what happens. So when we're talking about the award for energy, coming into real time, they have cleared 80 megawatts for energy. Now, we'll talk about how the day-ahead market results are essentially a financial position for the suppliers, and they could choose to take a different position in real time if they wanted to. There are many choices. We're going to go through one path or example here. If I don't do anything different with my day-ahead award for 80 megawatts, it becomes a self-schedule in real time. Now, not self-schedule from the perspective of you'll pay or you'll receive whatever the market clearing price is, because this clearing price for those megawatts will have already been set in day ahead, but it just flows into the market as a schedule. So they will receive dispatch instructions for at least 80 megawatts associated with this day ahead market award. For the additional awards they received, the ancillary services award for those 43 megawatts and the 10 megawatt RUC award, what they need to do with that day ahead information is submit bids for energy into real time to cover those day ahead awards. So, and I'm going to change the animation again here. So essentially what we're saying is, in real time, this resource will have an 80 megawatt self-schedule, and then 53 megawatts of an additional bid for energy over and above that 80 megawatt schedule going into hour ending 11 for this particular resource. So that is that gets to the 133 megawatts that Cameron was pointing out in the chat. He says in this particular hypothetical, is the generator dispatched at 133? In this particular example, they would be dispatched at 80, and then they would have an additional 53 megawatts on top of that 80 that the market could dispatch them up into in real time. So hopefully that answers your question, Cameron. Okay, good. Does anybody else have any questions about how that works? So let me just kind of recap it for you, and then we can tie up that discussion. I'm a supplier, I'm bidding into the day ahead. I've submitted self-schedules, I've submitted bids for energy economically, I've also bid into the RUC process, and I've also bid in for ancillary services. I basically put everything in onto the table for this particular hour. The market determines how it wants to use the resource for that hour. My day ahead awards, which come out at 1300 the day before. So I'm looking at the clock, it's 10:05. The market for trade date tomorrow, October 20th, closed 5 minutes ago. These market processes are now running. By 1300 this afternoon, I, the supplier, would get a report like what looks like on this screen, letting me know essentially what I have to do for real time for each one of the hours of that day. So hour ending 11, I know, okay, I'm awarded 80 megawatts of energy. I need to submit an economic curve to bid in the 53 megawatts that I was awarded both in ancillary services and in RUC. I need to submit bids for energy into the real-time market for that hour. Now, the way this works from a financial or from a settlement perspective, let's say in real time, I receive a dispatch of 90 megawatts. So 80 of those megawatts will be paid for at the day ahead price for energy that cleared associated with that day ahead award. The additional 10 megawatts that I was dispatched in real time will be paid to me at the real time price. In addition to that, if we back it up a little bit, whatever the price for ancillary services was for that particular hour, I would have received an ancillary services capacity award and price associated with those 43 megawatts. Actually, technically only the 40, you don't get paid for the self-provided. And also I would get a RUC payment. So there are capacity payments in the day ahead market, essentially paying for those reservations for energy. And then in real time, whatever you're awarded of those new real-time bids that you've submitted, you get paid for at that real-time energy price. So this resource would get a payment for the 80 megawatts at the day ahead price, the additional 10 megawatts at whatever that real-time price for energy was, along with whatever the ancillary services capacity payment was and the RUC payment. So just kind of to give you a picture of the pricing and how that works. When you get dispatched in real time, whatever the real-time prices are doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get paid for all of those megawatts at the real-time price, because there is a day-ahead element associated with that. So you'll get paid for your day-ahead megawatts at the day-ahead price and your real-time megawatts at the real-time price, which can be 15-minute pricing or 5-minute pricing as well, depending on when you're dispatched or committed. So I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of flavor about settlements with that. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to another example?
Rada, I see a hand up from Ori, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, this is Uri with Weeb. I just want to understand ancillary service bidding better. So I think in the beginning you said participants submit ancillary service amounts bid, I think. But in this table, I can see ancillary service itself and market and cleared. So I'm confusing if participants can self-schedule their AS. Is that right?
So I wanted to talk a little bit about self-provided ancillary services in this example, because from a WEIM or from an EDAM perspective, the way ancillary services are going to be procured for BAs outside of the California ISO footprint is through self-provision of ancillary services. That participating entity is essentially going to say, I am going to self-provide this many megawatts of ancillary services for my area. There isn't going to be a bidding in process for the EDAM ancillary services procurement. The way we procure ancillary services in the ISO market is through a bidding process. Now, part of the discussion earlier, and forgive me, I wasn't participating in the EDAM discussions, so I don't know the history behind why there's a separation between the way we're going to do it in EDAM versus the California ISO footprint. I don't know the history or the the reasoning why it's only going to be self-provided ancillary services, but that is the EDAM construct right now. So if we're thinking about this from an EDAM perspective, there will not be individual generators bidding in for ancillary services for their footprint. That EDAM area will be just self-providing ancillary services. So I hope that's not too confusing, but there's a little bit of difference between the way ancillary services is going to be handled in the ISO footprint versus if we're talking about it from the EDAM perspective outside of the ISO BA. So there won't be a payment for ancillary services through the ISO market in a kind of like spinning reserve or bidding capacity. Instead, the EDAM entities are going to set aside resources and say they're going to procure X amount of megawatts. And in this example here, if I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, the third column down where it says self-provided ancillary services, this is essentially the load serving entity saying, this is my resource, I plan to use them for 3 megawatts of ancillary services, and there is also no payment associated with the self-provision of ancillary services. So just the spinning piece would be cleared through the market. Does that help answer your question, or does that only confuse things further?
No. That's thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for your clarification. And so this table is showing ISO market and outside of ISO market.
Yes.
Essentially. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Using it for like both examples. Yeah. All right. Are we ready to move on to the next type of supplier? Rochelle, are there any more questions?
Do not have any additional questions at this time.
Okay. This was a bigger example in that there was a bunch of different products that we're going to take a look at. The next thing that I wanted to cover with you is a little bit of the difference or nuances with regard to battery or storage resources and how they participate in the market. So this particular example is going to go a little differently. I'm going to point out a couple of differences, and then we're going to look at a bid curve and kind of talk about the way batteries bid into the market. Now, a battery or a storage resource, as everyone is aware, you have the ability to either charge your resource, so you're consuming energy from the grid, or you're discharging and you're providing energy to the grid. If you are bidding economically, if you are providing an economic signal on behalf of this resource, you can combine both charging and discharging into one bid curve, essentially saying, let the market price determine in each hour whether I'm going to be charging or discharging. If the price is appropriate or lucrative, I'll go ahead and charge my battery at this time and then be able to discharge it later. So that is what that economic curve signifies, and I'm actually going to walk you through what one of those looks like because it's different and unique compared to everybody else who's bidding. You also have the ability to submit self-schedules for a battery resource, but because there is no price associated with a self-schedule, you essentially have to put it into either load or supply. You can't just say, here's my resource that I'm self-scheduling, do something with it, because the market kind of needs to know what direction you're kind of wanting to go in. So with this battery resource, if I submit a self-schedule for load, then my bid curve can only be in the charging trajectory. Or if I self-schedule my resource for supply, then it can only be discharging. So if you're self-scheduling, you're being very specific about how you want the market to treat that resource in that particular hour. Essentially, you're saying, I want to charge in this time, and I then want to discharge or provide energy in this time. But like I said, with an economic signal, you can put in prices that will drive the market to choose whether or not it's going to charge or discharge you based on what the clearing price is for that particular interval. So with that kind of foundation, I'm going to show you an example. We'll talk about this battery resource, and then we'll talk about actually the bid curve that they would be submitting and work through that. And so this will be a little bit of a variance or a detour from the typical examples that we're going to go through. So this particular resource, the Pmax value for the resource is positive and the Pmin value is negative. In the positive direction, I'm going to be discharging or providing energy to the grid. And in the negative megawatt, that will be treated as consumption, so I'm going to be charging this resource. We have something with a battery called a state of charge or a maximum state of charge, which is provided in megawatt hours, which also can help determine the duration or length of use of a battery. This resource has a maximum state of charge of 40 megawatt hours. And so what we're essentially saying is if I'm running it at its full output of 10 megawatts, it'd be a 4-hour battery. But if I'm operating it, let's say at 5 megawatts, I could stretch that out for 8 hours. So sometimes people will say, oh, that's a 4-hour battery, or that's a whatever, but it depends on how many megawatts that are being used across that time frame to determine actually the duration of time you can get out of it. But maybe, you know, you can think about it from the concept of it would be a maximum of a 4-hour battery if we're going to run it at full capacity across a time period. So again, the Pmax is 10 and the Pmin is -10. And I'm going to kind of walk you through an example of what a bid curve would look like. And in order to do that, I need to do a little bit of setup here behind the scenes. I'm going to switch the presenter to my, my whiteboard here, which I just realized I don't think I dialed in, unfortunately. So if you'll bear with me for just a second, I need to dial in really fast on my whiteboard, unless I can quickly share this. So while I'm fiddling behind the scenes, I'm not going to show you my confused face. So I'll stop the video here and switch over to the whiteboard.
While Rada is doing that, let's go ahead and do a quick pulse check. We want to see where everyone is at with this information. So this is going to be a little participatory. If you guys really quickly in the chat could let me know from 1 to 5 how comfortable you feel with the information that Rada has shared so far. 1 being I am completely confused. I need to sit into this training. You know, I'm looking for more information. And 5 being like, I got this. It's making total sense to me. So really quickly, can everyone go ahead and put a number 1 through 5 through the chat? We just want to get a sense of where people are at and if there are certain things that Rada should go over more. All right. Thanks for participating, Mariah. Thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, Jason. Thank you, Samantha. Okay, we're looking good. Great. Thanks, Adam and Gia. All right. We have 3s and 4s. That's great. That's great. I love it. 3.76, Laura. I like the specificity. All right. Oh, and we do have a question too. What is SOC? And Rada, I'm sure that you will go right into that. So I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Yeah. So I decided instead of having you watch me draw this out on my whiteboard, I wanted to use it. I thought it would be really fun, but I'm like, you know what? Let's just show you what the bid curves looks like. So I've got this additional example that or this other Word document that I'm going to pull it up and just show you in. So instead of you just watching me write, I've kind of already built it here. This is my plan B. So I've got this example here, and what I want to zero in on first is this day-ahead bid curve. So SOC is state of charge. Now, the market keeps track of a resource's state of charge across a time period, because we need to know where the battery is in that -10 to 10 megawatt band to know where they are and how much they can either charge or discharge. So from a day-ahead perspective, when they're submitting bids into the market, they let us know where their state of charge is going to be for hour ending 1 for that particular hour, so that the market can optimize that battery across that time period. So this day-ahead bid curve is showing negative megawatts at the top, and then if we read down, so it says -10 to -0.1 to 0 and up to 5 and 10. And so we kind of read this bid curve by starting at the 0 point. And I've written over here on the screen for you just to give you a visual. This bid curve indicates or sends an economic signal saying if the price is $1.01 or less, go ahead and charge my battery. So if we're reading for from 0 to -0.1, you can see this dollar amount of -0.1 all the way up until -10. And that's a kind of or less in that general direction. Now, if we read this example from a 0 and go up to 10, what we're saying is if the price is $5 or more, go ahead and discharge me up to 5 megawatts. And one thing about the way ISO bid curves are structured, you kind of read down from 1 megawatt quantity to the other, so from 0 to 5, and then you kind of read up and to the right for the price. So what we're saying is from 0 to 5 megawatts, if the price is $5 or more, go ahead and discharge me up to 5 megawatts. And if the price is $20 or more, go ahead and discharge me up to 10 megawatts. So the way this bid curve is structured, it's essentially saying when it's really cheap or in the negatives, go ahead and charge me up. And then when the prices go above $5 is when I want to start discharging or providing energy. So we'll talk about that first, and then I have another piece down here at the bottom about potential market awards. But before we talk about what your market awards could potentially be, I wanted to see if anybody has any questions about this bid curve in general.
I do not see any questions at this time, although, Rod, I do want to just double check. Did you respond to what an SOC is? I might have missed that. Okay.
Yeah, SOC. Yeah.
I think we're all good on this end.
All right, so I'm going to make this a little bigger so that we can talk about potential market awards. Across the top of the column here, the market will keep track of, and so I've just put in a numerical representation of what that state of charge is going to be. Leading into the hours of the day, the market is going to be either charging or discharging this battery based on where they currently are, what the economic signal the resource is sending, and what the current market prices are. I did also want to point out that there may be some times when you are awarded differently or outside of your economic curve, not just for a battery resource, but for any resource in general. And it may be because, in this case, for this battery, the market may be setting you up to have you fully charged so that you can discharge later when needed. And so I wanted to point out that for hour ending 2, 3, and 4, even though the bid curve essentially said if the price is $1.01 or less, go ahead and charge me. In this particular example, I'm actually saying the market clearing price ended up being $2, but the market awarded this resource anyway. And essentially the reason why is because for the coming hours, the battery was fully charged and able to take advantage of those higher prices that were coming later. In other words, the market is going to make it up to you later, even though we maybe were charging you outside of your economic signal here. And I wanted to just make up this example to bring to the table 2 points of discussion. The first is that there's an element called bid cost recovery, which we're not really going to talk about a lot in this particular session, but we did spend some time about this bid cost recovery when we talked to you in June about the way the market works. But essentially, the market is ensuring that you're going to be made whole across the entirety of that across the entirety of the trade date. So there may be times when you receive market awards that don't seem to match up with what your economic signal is, and you need to view it more from the lens of the entire trade date than one specific trade hour, because one specific trade hour does not necessarily tell the story of the full day. So the takeaway from this particular session is, number one, if I'm a battery resource and I'm providing a series of economic bids, the market can control whether I'm charging or discharging based on the economic signal I'm sending, based on what the prices are at the time. And separately, not just for a battery resource, but for other resources as well. There may be times where you are awarded uneconomically, and if you take a look at one particular hour, you may be confused as to why you would receive award outside of your bid range that you had indicated was acceptable. And it could be that for that particular trade hour, there may have been a price that's either too low or too high as compared to what your bid price was. But across the entirety of the full day, the goal is to make sure that the resource is made whole. And that is done by a separate process called bid cost recovery. So I know I kind of threw a lot at you in this example. So I wanted to see if you had any questions about this particular situation or potential market outcomes that might occur. Now's the time to kind of talk through that. Are there any questions?
We do have a question in the chat from Charlene. She asks that we explain how the battery could be charging or dispatching up to 10 megawatts an hour for 3 consecutive hours, as it looks like it's a 20 megawatt battery.
Oh yeah, for sure. Let me put something else on the screen really fast to reorient us to this example. The way that we keep track of the resource is a little bit different for batteries. So over here on the left, this particular resource has a Pmax of 10, but it's a state of charge. So we keep track of what the output capability is, but also a state of charge is how long it can maintain that output. So in this particular example, they have a maximum state of charge of 40 megawatt hours, which means I can give you 10 megawatts fully for a period of 4 hours. So that's why I could be discharged for 10 megawatts for 3 consecutive hours, because I have a maximum state of charge of 40 megawatt hours for this particular resource. So that's one thing, and then I'll show you the example again. Across the top of the screen here, the market keeps track of what your current state of charge is. So in this example, we're saying we started off with a state of charge of 20, and then the market award had them discharge or provide 10. So then back at the top here of column right above hour ending 2, now I'm down to a state of charge of 10. And so then essentially I get charged up to my full 40 across this period of time, hour ending 2, 3, and 4. And then I go into hour ending 5 with a 40 megawatt per hour state of charge. So now technically I could be discharging 10 megawatts for 4 hours in a row. I think that answers Charlene's question. And then I think maybe there's other questions as well.
Yeah, Rod, it looks like Charlene is good to go. Cameron just echoed Charlene's question. So Cameron, if you are still have follow-up questions on that, let me know. But we do have a question from Aiden in the chat. It says, so is this curve saying that for hour ending 2, 3, and 4 charge, even though my bid was only to charge, if the price is $1.01 less, the market will still charge battery because overall overall, I benefit from the prices in the other hour endings.
That's correct. So in this example, the way I constructed it was to say, yes, we said if the price is $1.01 or less, charge me. The price ends up being $2, but the market determines that we're going to charge this battery in that time period because we're optimizing for the full 24 hours. And we kind of see, and every time I say we, I need to point out it's not humans. It's the market engine that does this, because sometimes I've had people ask me questions like, why would they be doing this? It's not a person. So the market calculation looks at the resource and the full 24 hours and figures out the best time period to optimize the charging of that. So yes, Aiden, in answer to your question, we're saying we charge the resource in this particular time period so that they could then be fully available to discharge later when the prices were more in the range where they would actually be economic. And I think by the notes there, that makes sense to Aiden and to Charlene. And yes, to go back to what Cameron was saying, at the top here, we started the day at a state of charge of 20, which means technically I could either discharge for 2 hours and give you my full capacity, or you could choose to charge me up to my 40 so that I could be used from my 40 megawatt state of charge later. And that's what, in this particular situation, that's what happened. And it could go either way depending on where they are in the state of charge. But this was just one path or one example that we took through to say the market will see where you are, will discharge you or charge you based on where you are and where you need to be, and also somewhat following the price signal. But just like battery resources, there also could be other resources that receive a market award that doesn't seem to match their economic bid in a particular hour. But you have to keep in mind that the day-ahead market optimizes across the full 24 hours to figure out the best way to use the resource across that entire, what we call a time horizon or time period. All right, so I think I'm going to close that example and go back to here and then see if we have any further questions.
We did have a further question, but it looks like you already answered it, Radha, so we are good to go.
Okay. All right, and then this example, this picture is the example that we just went through. So that was, like I said, this was a slightly different way of taking a look at the market results and also giving me an opportunity to introduce the complexity of the bid cost recovery process, which, like I said, is designed to ensure that a resource remains or whole across the full trade day, not necessarily individual trade hours. So I think we touched on that point as well. And so from here, I'm just going to close this chat window a little bit so I can see my screen. From here, we're going to go into a different example. We're going to set aside physical suppliers for a moment, and we're going to talk about convergence bidding examples to kind of wrap up the day ahead discussion. One thing that I wanted to point out with virtual participants is virtual bidding is a strictly financial participation construct. In the ISO market, we call it convergence bidding. If you were not with us in June, we had a long discussion that you can kind of tap into by listening to the recording of the June session, where we talk about the nuances and the whys of convergence bidding, why it's there, what it does for the market. So I would suggest if you have questions about that, definitely tune into the recording of the June session that we conducted. There are also computer-based training modules on the ISO website in our Learning Center that will touch on the market construct in general and also these elements. But I did want to, as a side note, mention, because virtual bidding is financial participation only, at the time the bids are submitted, there is what we call a dynamic credit check that gets performed to make sure that they have essentially enough credit or collateral to cover those financial bids that they are submitting. And the reason why I wanted to bring that point up is because often, especially with folks that are less familiar with virtual bidding and how it works and maybe what it does for the market, there may be a little bit of concern as to why we're allowing these financial participants to be also participating in the day ahead and maybe what impacts may be felt because of that. So I wanted to point out that there is a dynamic credit check done at the time of bid submission to make sure they do have enough credit and collateral to cover the bids that they are submitting for that particular day. And they basically figure out what your available credit limit is by taking a look at your credit limit minus your estimated aggregated liability, which is all of the bids you may have been submitted up to that time for previous trade dates that hadn't necessarily cleared. So there is some an element of stability there when it comes to that financial participation with this credit check that's done at the beginning. So just wanted to point that out, and then we'll talk about how it actually works. The point of convergence bidding is submitting either a demand bid, a virtual demand bid, or a virtual supply bid. There are a list of convergence bidding nodes on the ISO website in our OASIS tool. OASIS stands for Open Access, Same Time Information System. So in OASIS, there's a list of nodes that can be bid on. So a convergence bidding participant will select a node at a particular trade hour and say, I'm going to submit if we talk about 10 megawatt supply bid, I'm going to submit a bid for virtual supply at this particular node at this particular price point. With demand bids, they're going to pick a specific node and say, clear this bid as if it was virtual demand. They're going to have a price associated with that. There is no ability to do a self-schedule for convergence bidding because the goal of this is to select a node in day ahead, try to determine whether or not the real-time price is going to be higher or lower from that day ahead price, and possibly gain a financial position by guessing correctly whether it's virtual supply or virtual demand. So from the perspective of demand, if I'm demand, I'm a consumer, so I'm going to buy at the day ahead price, sell back at the real-time price, and the difference is, from their perspective, hopefully what they are able to earn. From a supply bid perspective, if I am a seller, I want to sell at a higher price and then buy it back in real time at a lower price. So essentially, I select a load node or a supply node. I place a bid at that location with a particular price and megawatt quantity, and then I receive my day-ahead awards, which I'll show you what those look like. I receive my day-ahead awards in the tool that provides me my confidential market information. So I will see in this example how many megawatts cleared for each one of those bids. And then I will look into the OASIS tool at the actual day-ahead prices. So if I'm a convergence bidding participant, I submit my bids by 10 a.m. I get this report by 1300, so I know how many megawatts cleared and what the day-ahead price was. And then I need to wait until real time to see what those real-time market prices are. And there is a OASIS report as well that I take a look at that tells me the real-time prices. And bids are liquidated at the average of the 4 15-minute market locational marginal prices. So if I'm a convergence bidder, I have to wait for that hour to happen or occur in real time so that there's a price associated with each one of those 15-minute intervals. And then I will know the answer to, was the day-ahead price lower or higher than the real-time price, which will determine whether or not I made money in that particular hour. So that's kind of at a high level how that works. Does anybody have any questions about that? Before I answer the questions, I did want to say, from a participation perspective, there is nothing that a convergence bidding participant is doing in real time. There are no real-time bids from convergence bidders, solely day-ahead bids. In real time, they're just waiting to see what the prices are for that particular hour. So what are your questions about convergence bidding? Go ahead and let me know.
Rada, we have a question in the chat from Maria. She asks, every node is associated with the generation resource and or are nodes associated with something else or more?
Yes, it could be either a generating node or a load node. And the convergence bidding is unique in that they can place bids at either generator nodes or load nodes. It doesn't matter which node they select because there's not a physical transaction associated with that. But if I'm a supplier, I am placing bids at my one individual supplier node. And if I am a load, I have what was called a load, or all of my individual load nodes are aggregated together in one, what we call LAP, or load aggregation point, or default load aggregation point. So let's say I'm a load serving entity in our very first example for demand. If I'm a load serving entity and I might have 20 individual load nodes in my territory, I bid all of that together in one DLAP, or default load aggregation point, basically saying from my entire footprint, I'm going to be consuming 5,000 megawatts in that hour. So I don't need to parse it out by my individual load nodes when I'm bidding for my load serving entity or for my demand footprint. And then, yes, as a supplier, I'm saying I am a supplier at this one individual location, which is where I'm going to be injecting my power into the grid, and that's the location that I'm bidding at. I think that answers the question based on the notes there in the chat. Thanks, Mariah.
Hey, Rob, we have another question. Could you please explain how the LMP is calculated again?
Yes, absolutely. So the LMP, or the locational marginal price, is going to be calculated based on, so in day ahead, it's where the bid in demand and bid in supply curves cross. That sets the LMP for energy, and there's also, which is the market clearing price for energy for that particular hour. In day ahead, it will be the same exact price for everyone for that hour. But there is also, and if we can look at, this is a great example to have on the screen when we talk about this column here in the middle that says LMP type. The LMP, which is the number highlighted in the dark blue, is the one locational marginal price, and then underneath it, it shows you how that breaks out into energy, congestion, and losses. So in this example, for this particular interval, if we're looking at interval 1, the price of energy was $25.98 and some additional decimals. So every node that's getting paid in this particular interval, hour ending 11, interval 1, is receiving $25 and some cents for energy, but there's also there's also congestion and losses that are calculated into that LMP. So the price of energy in day ahead is where the supply and demand bid curves cross. In real time, it is based on the load forecast. So we use the load forecast to drive the market to procure energy. So we'll clear up to the load forecast based on the supply curves that we have in real time. So it's handled a little bit differently than in real time and day ahead, but there's always a component of energy, congestion, and losses. There's also a greenhouse gas element. I'm not really going to touch on that in this session, but I did speak about greenhouse gas component when we talked about the LMP in the session in June. So if you're curious about the greenhouse gas component, you can watch the June recording, and then you'll get your questions answered there. So that is convergence bidding. Does anybody have any additional questions on this before we move on to the other examples?
I do not see any additional questions in the chat or any hands raised.
All right, thanks, Rochelle. So we gave you four examples that started off in day ahead and followed the resource or the demand provider all the way until real time to figure out what happens. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the nuances between day ahead and real time before we talk about two real-time examples. A couple points that I wanted to make. First of all, the day ahead market is a financial position only. The energy has not flowed yet, and so it is a plan for the way that the grid is going to be managed for the following day. Each hour has a specific set of resources lined up, and a specific plan for how many megawatts they're going to be generating, but in real time, the amount of actual demand in that time period might be more or less, and so the market needs to adjust the schedule to what is actually happening. So the day-ahead market is a financial position only. From the perspective of a scheduling coordinator, whatever your day-ahead market results are directly affect financially what your real-time position is. A scheduling coordinator is expected to deliver whatever those day-ahead market awards are, and if they can't, they need to bid something else. I often get asked, what is the penalty or what are the consequences for not showing up or not providing? And there aren't penalties over and above being financially responsible for having to pay back at the real-time price for the megawatts that you didn't generate at the day-ahead price, if that makes sense. So if we go back to that supplier example, they were awarded 80 megawatts of energy in real time at hour ending 11. Something might happen to that resource where they're not able to actually provide those 80 megawatts. They are still expected to deliver the 80 megawatts, and if not, then they will have to pay it back at whatever the real-time price is. So there is a settlement implication, or there are financial implications associated with not providing the energy that you were awarded in day ahead, but there isn't a separate penalty on top of that. So I wanted to kind of just make that point known. From the perspective of ancillary services, I did want to point out, if I'm in the California ISO footprint and I am submitting bids for ancillary services and receiving awards for ancillary services, I have to submit real-time energy bids for those awards. And there's a nuance that says essentially, depending on the type of award I receive will determine how my self-schedule or my economic bid needs to be constructed. So there's regulation up, which is providing additional energy, and there's regulation down, which is taking energy off of the grid. And so there are, for regulation down, I essentially need to come in at a specific place at the full capacity of my resource scheduled so that I could come down from that. And then regulation up, I can submit a bid to say this is where I am and this is what I can provide up from that point. So sometimes it depends on the type of resource and the award that you get, the type, what you'll have to do in real time. Are there any questions on those two items?
Yeah, we do have a question in the chat. Cameron asks, what does something else mean for SDs?
Let me go back to that slide here so we can talk about it. Or they can choose, let's see. Scheduling coordinators are expected to deliver their day ahead award in real time or bid something else. So rebid that resource in a different way, essentially saying maybe I'm not able to generate, so they would essentially submit a bid that's essentially buying it back at the real time price, putting in a different megawatt quantity. Maybe something happened and they're not able to provide 80 megawatts, so they'll back that resource out by submitting what we call a DEC or a decremental bid to take them down from that day ahead position. So the do something else is if you can't deliver the megawatts that you've been awarded, you can rebid them in or you can bid to buy it back. But essentially, kind of the point that I was trying to make, which hopefully was clear, is that that you are on the hook or responsible for the difference between what your day ahead award was versus what your real-time activity actually is. Hopefully that answers it. Okay, looks like it did.
And you had a question, will you talk a little bit more about demand bids? What happens if real-time load is less than the load awarded in the day-ahead market?
Oh, good question. And I meant to talk about that when we were talking about demand, so I'm glad that you're asking that now. With the demand bids, so in our example, they received a day-ahead award for 5,000 megawatts for hour ending 11. if they did not consume 5,000 megawatts, then they essentially, let's see, they essentially are paid the difference at the real-time price of whatever that real-time price is. So they've paid for 5,000 megawatts at the day-ahead price of whatever it ends up being. When we look at the meter for that resource and they only consumed, let's say, 4,500, there'll be the difference adjusted or settled at the real-time price. It's just not always a guarantee that the real-time price will be lower than the day-ahead price, so there may be some financial implications associated with that. But there is always a settlement and metering process that occurs where we take a look at what the real-time meter was, both for a provider or a consumer, and make any adjustments as necessary, comparing the day-ahead award to the real-time actual meter. That makes sense. Does that answer your question, Keisha?
Not totally. So if you're saying that they will receive a credit, so if they said they had 5,000 megawatts of load and it cleared at the price that it did, and then they only show up with 4,500, that 500 megawatts is treated like a credit in the settlement at
right.
the real-time rate?
At the real-time rate.
Okay. And so that doesn't create an incentive for load serving entities to overbid their, to over forecast. It's because the real-time price could be higher, could be lower. So there's no incentive there. Is that right?
Correct. And that's why the concept of saying they get credited, I want to kind of caveat that by saying the real-time price is not always necessarily lower than the day-ahead price. So they're on the hook for whatever the difference is between what they were awarded compared to what they consumed, and that gets settled at the real-time price, which can vary. So it may be that they have to, maybe that they get paid back at a lower price than what they purchased it for in day ahead, or they get paid back at a higher price. You're never actually quite sure. So like you said, there really isn't necessarily a built-in incentive to over procure, because you might be getting paid back in a way that doesn't actually benefit you necessarily.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so where were we? I think we answered the question about slide 27, and then we got to 28. So we'll talk about commitment costs, which I believe the Stanford team is going to talk about. And so I'll kind of tee this up for you here, and then hopefully throughout the examples that you go through in days 2 and 3 with them, you're able to kind of work through and kind of put this into practice. So actually, before we get to that, I think there was one other follow-up question before we introduce a new concept. Maybe Rochelle, you can help me out with that.
Yeah, just some clarification on the last question. So are you meaning on the hook for buying back the energy at the real-time price if they over procure in the day ahead?
Right, so if I over procured in day ahead, I bought 5,000 megawatts for hour ending 11 and I only used 4,500, I actually get credited for the 500 megawatts that I didn't procure, or I'm sorry, that I didn't consume, but it will be at the real-time price. And the real-time price may be higher or lower than the day-ahead price, so it kind of just depends in each hour how that will affect the settlement. All right, I think we're good with that one. So instead of going over commitment costs now, I do want to respect the breaks. So we'll take our 5-minute break here. It's 10:55. We'll come back at 11 and go through the rest of the material. So we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Okay, it's 11 o'clock and we are back. We have one more hour of this session, which I think is going well. I think that there's a lot of good questions and interaction, and I really appreciate your participation. So we'll make sure that we continue that for the next hour. Again, commitment costs. This is something that I wanted to bring up with you because I know that it's part of some of the exercises that you're going to be doing with the Stanford team. I wanted to point out that there's different parameters for what we call startup or minimum load values. We have something called a BPM, or Business Practice Manual, which drives a lot of, or which contains a lot of information about how market processes work. Some of the points that I wanted to make from that particular one are there are different ways to register or set up a resource in the market. Some of them have registered costs and others of them have proxy costs. There's very few registered cost resources because a lot of resources have variable costs associated with, for example, fuel cost. So for proxy cost, there's essentially a calculation that adds in the fuel cost or the gas price for a particular region on a particular day to help calculate what that startup and minimum load cost is. So some of these costs are very specific and get registered. Most of them are in some sort of a proxy cost format, which allows for fluctuation in fuel cost to be associated with that resource. Obviously, that would only apply to those resources that are gas-fired resources, for example, but there's other variabilities that are taken into account. So when you are submitting bids in the day ahead, it is possible that your startup and minimum load costs get set based on what those day ahead costs were, and that will affect settlements when we're settling that actual trade date. Any day ahead awards get settled at the day ahead costs for startup and minimum load. And in real time, you also have the ability to bid in one point here with the startup and the minimum load cost that can be set in the day ahead time frame. It's set up in the bidding tool as a daily component. So it has one price associated with startup and minimum load from a day ahead perspective. In real time, those startup and minimum load costs could fluctuate across the series of hours. In real time, any bids for hours that have not already been awarded in the day ahead time frame can have a new daily bid for startup and minimum load costs. And in real time, once that resource gets awarded in a particular hour, the startup and minimum load cost associated with that particular hour gets set and used for the entire trade date. And the reason why I bring this up is to make 2 points. Number one, commitment costs may vary between day ahead and real time. And number two, when it comes to the settlement of bid cost recovery, where the goal is to make a resource whole across an entire trade date, the calculation of startup and minimum load costs associated with that resource may vary across a series of hours, depending on when that resource received its market award, whether it was day ahead or real time or both. Different prices could actually be used in the calculation and settlement of that bid cost recovery. So before I move on to the next slide, does anybody have any questions about commitment costs in this context here?
I don't see any questions currently, Radha.
Okay, thanks. Another thing I wanted to mention is the way that outages are treated. So from the day ahead perspective, you may have an outage set up on a resource that has a specific planned end time. My resource is going to be out for this many hours. When the market is analyzing that scenario, it takes the startup time that it takes to start that resource up and adds it to the time of the outage before the day ahead market will award that unit. That is to allow for the planning of starting up that resource after that outage is over. And because this has not happened yet, it's looking into the future, it's saying it's going to be out for maintenance, and then we have to start it up. When it comes to real time, it's actually treated differently. because the market, when you are actually indicating that you are back in service, the way you determine that the way you update the outage tool to indicate that you are back in service already adds in that startup time into the calculation. So just the point here to make is to be aware of, and this might be a little bit in the weeds for you folks because you're not probably submitting outages and things like that, but just an idea to keep track of, that if I have an outage that's ending at a specific time period in real time, let's say 6:59 a.m., and I have a bid for hour ending 8, which is 7 to 8, the market could dispatch that resource if we're talking about real time, but if that bid in was for day ahead, it would wait the startup time. It would wait for the startup time of that resource, whatever it might be, before it would issue a market award. So there's just a little bit of nuance with regard to outages. I'll also talk about one other thing, and then we'll stop to see if we've got any questions on the topics. All right, so another thing that I wanted to point out is that when we are managing the grid, there are transactions that occur between balancing authority areas. And those transactions, or the tracking of energy flow across these different BAs, falls into the category of something called interchange scheduling, essentially scheduling the flow of energy across the transmission lines that connect each one of these balancing areas. There's something called an E-tag, or an electronic tag, that is used to keep track of the flow of energy as it flows across these various BAAs. I did want to mention that from the perspective of the WEIM, or the Western Energy Imbalance Market, the transactions that occur between balancing areas all get rolled up into one thing called ETSR, which stands for Energy Transfer System Resource. So essentially, at a higher level, we're tracking the amount of energy flow between the different balancing areas, let's say Arizona and Nevada. All of those transactions that occur between those two inside of the WEIM market are kind of all rolled up into what we call an ETSR that keeps track of the total energy flow across or between these BAAs. Similarly, for the entire WEIM footprint, everything that's transacted between the BAAs in the WEIM market is rolled up into something called an ETSR. And I wanted to mention that because some folks might be curious about how the transfer of energy works and how we keep track of that. If we're in the ISO BA only from a day-ahead market perspective, let us say, and we have a resource that's exporting their or importing their energy into the ISO market, there would be an E tag associated with that one individual transaction. But from either an EDAM or a WEIM construct, when we're talking about how energy flows across the BAAs, it all gets rolled up into this one larger aggregated tag. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there in case people were curious about that. And with that stated, does anybody have any questions about the outages information or tagging that we just talked about?
There are currently no questions.
All right. Moving on to the next. Oh, there was some animation here that showed you about the flow. I should have clicked through that. So that was the last item that I wanted to talk about. In this piece, I do have one more difference between day ahead and real time, but I'll talk about that when we get to the variable energy resource example to put it into a better context for you. So now I have two examples that I wanted to go through that start off in the real-time market. I did want to say that in the real-time market, we do pull in data from the day-ahead market, whatever the energy schedules were, the awards for reserves, and then in real time, there are new bids from currently the WEIM participants along with their base schedules. In real time, these examples will focus on the actual real-time dispatches, startup and shutdowns, and the startup and shutdowns fall into the category, what we've talked about earlier, as commitments, right? When you hear the word commitment, it's the ISO market is choosing to turn this resource on or off. And so that's associated with a startup or a shutdown instruction. So that in real time, we'll focus on that. And here again is the slide that we discussed at the beginning of the session. So we've moved down into the real-time area. We talked about a bunch of examples from day ahead, and we kind of walked through each one of those examples and talked through how that might have real-time implications. Now we're going to have a couple of different examples that go through, that start off in real time, and we'll talk through those nuances. Before we do that, I did want to mention that in real time, I had said the real-time market opens when the day-ahead market results are published. So that is at about 1300 this afternoon. And it's open up until 75 minutes before each individual trade hour. In real time, we have what we call base schedules that are provided from our WEIM participants. If you think about the example that I gave for you for the supplier from the day-ahead perspective, their day-ahead market award becomes a real-time market schedule or self-schedule. From the WEIM participation lens, there was no day-ahead market award, so we used the base schedule to determine where the resource start off as, to determine how much or where they're going to go, or how much they're going to be dispatched in real time. So we need a starting point for the resource so that the market knows where they are and where they could be going. And we use base schedules for the WEIM participants, similar to the day-ahead schedules from the day-ahead market CAISO footprint participants. In real time, there are 3 processes. The first is called the hour-ahead scheduling process. This applies to resources that are providing import or export bids that are intertie transactions only, for folks that have the ability only to move in hourly blocks, meaning they can't move every 15 minutes, every 5 minutes. So we have a special process called the hour-ahead scheduling process that allows us to pick up those resources and schedule them out for a full hour of output. That is the HAS process, or hour-ahead scheduling process. We also have what's called the 15-minute market. So every 15 minutes, we're analyzing the coming forecast to determine what resources we need to start up or shut down in that time horizon. Think of the 15-minute market as setting up or positioning the resources, making sure the ones we need on are going to be started up, and the ones that are no longer needed are going to be shut down. That's the 15-minute market interval and what happens there. Then there's the 5-minute dispatch, when the resource is actually receiving an award that they should be following in order to provide energy to the grid. So every 15 minutes, we're looking at a couple of hours out to determine if we have all of the resources online to meet that future need, or if there are any resources that we need to bring up or shut down to adjust to that forecast. But it's every 5 minutes when the market is going to actually be sending out a dispatch instruction to the resources and having them either start up or, they've already been started up or shut down in the 15-minute process. In the 5-minute dispatch, from where they are, they may receive an instruction to either increase or decrease their output, or perhaps stay the same. I've got a visual that kind of lines this out on a timeline, and then I'll ask to see if you have any questions about that. So from a real-time perspective, from a forecasting, we look out about 5 hours at the forecast that's coming to determine if there are any additional resources that need to be committed or brought online. That process is called the short-term unit commitment process. And that looks at about 4.5 hours. We then have in the 75 minutes prior to the trade hour, that's when the market processes actually kick off. That's the deadline for all of those bids and base schedules to be submitted. And then, as I mentioned, the 15-minute market. What's happening in this set of intervals are we're starting up or shutting down resources. In the ISO BA, we're also procuring any additional ancillary services if needed. And then depending on whether that resource was awarded in day ahead or real time will determine how they get paid for that energy. In other words, going back to that supplier example that we had earlier, they had a day ahead market award of 80 megawatts. When they receive a dispatch instruction in the 15-minute market to start that resource up and get to 80, they're going to be paid for that 80 at whatever the day ahead price was. But additionally or incrementally to that, in the 5-minute market, if you receive an instruction to go over and above that 80 in one of the 5-minute intervals, then for, let's say we move them to 85, they'll get paid for the 80 at the day ahead price, and they'll get paid for the additional 5 megawatts at whatever that real-time 5-minute price is. So depending on when the resource was awarded will determine the price of energy they receive for that supply. And a call back to the demand participant, similar situation. From the demand perspective, you will have already paid for X amount of megawatts at the day ahead price. We compare that consumption to the meter to determine how that needs to be settled. And if you will be paid back for megawatts that you did not consume, that will be paid back for at the real-time price. Let's see. One other thing before I'll ask for questions is just a mention of our, it's called Automated Dispatch System, or ADS. That is the actual tool that drives all of the resources. So every 15 minutes, the market is figuring out what resources we need to start up or shut down. There's also resources that can be operated in multiple different configurations. Those are called multi-stage generators. And so every 15 minutes, it's determining how those resources are going to be positioned. And then in the 5-minute intervals, the market is using real-time dispatch instructions to dispatch each one of those resources. So that was a little bit of an overview of how the real-time market works. What questions do you have for me on that?
Cameron wants to know how are 5-minute prices set?
Good question. So we have the bids that are submitted 75 minutes before the top of the hour are submitted for that entire hour. So the bids that were submitted for hour ending 11, let's say, will be used in both the 15-minute market and the 5-minute interval runs. So resources will be submitting their bids for that particular hour. And every time the market processor runs for either the 15-minute or the 5-minute interval, it will use those hourly bids that were submitted with those hourly prices to determine if we're going to procure additional megawatts at what price based on the bids that were submitted by all of those resources. Does that answer your question, Cameron? Okay, good. That was an overview of the real-time market processes, and now we're going to talk about 2 examples in real-time bidding. Currently, we have WEIM participation that is real-time only, so I saved this example for this section. And I also wanted to talk about how the forecast for a variable energy resource affects its real-time market awards, so I put that into the real-time category as well. So we'll go through these 2 examples. The first is for WEIM, a participating resource. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to just take a moment to talk about the difference between participating and non-participating, because it might be confusing for some. In the WEIM construct, we have what's called a non-participating resource, which means I'm a resource inside of a WEIM BA, but I'm choosing not to bid economically in the real-time market. I don't have a special agreement. My resource information is included in the full network model because we use that model for energy flow calculations. And I provide a base schedule because that is going to be my energy schedule for that particular hour. But there is no offer of additional economic bids into the market. I'm not offering to supply anything more than what my base schedule is. There are also resources that fall into a different category called participating resources. And that means I am going to be bidding in the real-time market. In addition to, so I have an agreement, I have information in what we call master file, which is a database that we keep track of all of the different resources and all of their characteristics, such as the Pmin and Pmax of the resource, the fuel type, a bunch of details. In addition to submitting base schedules for this resource, I'm also going to be submitting economic bids over and above my base schedule, essentially offering my excess supply to the WEIM footprint. So that's the difference between the two types of resources. And now we'll walk through an example of bidding activity for one of those participating resources. So here my resource has a Pmin of 25 and a Pmax of 100. And I am saying that I'm submitting a 70 megawatt base schedule that's going to be used to serve native load inside of my WEIM BA. In addition, I want to offer the remaining capacity on that resource into the market economically. That may be used to serve load in my BA, or it might be used to serve load in another BA for another WEIM entity. I also add to this bid what we call a GHG adder. And I only mention this here because when we go over, when we talked about this in June, we talked about how the locational marginal price is constructed. I mentioned that there was a greenhouse gas component that gets added to the LMP if it's determined that your resource was used to serve load in California. So this is where you would put that GHG adder in at the time of bidding. And essentially what you're saying is these megawatts are being offered for dispatch into either my own footprint or into another BA, respecting transfer limits. So there has to be transfer capability available to allow those megawatts to flow into that area. We've talked about GHG one or two times in this session. If you're curious about how that calculation actually works, I would suggest that you listen into the recording that we have for the June session that talks about the day-ahead market, because you'll get that, that nuance and that color there. So in this example, we're saying that this particular resource offered 70 megawatts into a base schedule and 30 megawatts economically. So if we were going to carry this through to a real-time example, let's say this resource was dispatched for 100 megawatts in this particular hour. That means it got awarded the full 30 megawatts that it was offering economically over and above the 70 megawatt base schedule. Now, I wanted to make a point here from a settlements perspective. The megawatts that are included in the base schedule are not settled inside of the ISO market. The base schedule is my schedule that I'm coming into. I'm planning to use these megawatts to serve native load. That gets settled outside of the WEIM market settlements process. The WEIM market only settles the imbalances or the difference between the base schedule and the actual meter. So if I have a base schedule of 70 and a market award of 30, I'm getting paid through the ISO market for those 30 megawatts at whatever that real-time market price is. But those 70 megawatts, which is native load, so yes, load inside of my one individual BA, that gets settled however it gets settled today, not through the ISO market. The energy, or the WEIM, the Western Energy Imbalance Market, only settles the imbalances from that base schedule starting point, if you will.
Rada, I'm going to go ahead and, if it's okay, Warrior's had her hand up for just a bit, so I want to call on her, make sure that she gets an opportunity to ask her question.
Absolutely, go for it.
Oh, thank you. So my question is actually related to the previous session, so real-time process. And I am thinking about the settlement perspective. And the participants will get paid by day-ahead market price up to their day-ahead market awards. And if there's a difference between real-time market and day-ahead market, the imbalance will be paid by real-time price. But I was a little bit confused about the real-time price. My knowledge is that there's two real-time price, which is FMM price and RTD price. So
Yes.
which one
Yes.
will be used in this case? And if that's the RTD, what is when the FMM price is utilized in the market from the
Yes.
market settlement perspective?
Yes. So it will depend on when you receive that award. So if you receive an FMM instruction to start up in the 15-minute market, that will be at the 15-minute price. And then if you receive additional instructions in the real-time market or 5-minute dispatches, then you'll get paid for that at the 5-minute price. So it could be layered on top of each other. If we're thinking about from a day-ahead market perspective, you'll get an award for, let's say, 80 megawatts, so you'll get paid for that at the day-ahead price. Then you might get a 15-minute market instruction to move from 80 to 90. The additional 10 would be at the 15-minute market price. And then maybe in the 5-minute dispatch, you're asked to go up to 95. You'll get paid for those additional 5 megawatts at that 5-minute interval price. So it's when you receive that market award will determine which of the prices you are being paid for those megawatts. And it could be that particular trade hour, you're being paid for a certain amount of your megawatts in the day ahead, and then the 15-minute, and then in the 5-minute pricing structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so is it also possible that you can only pay by day ahead and FMM, or day ahead price and real RTD price? Is that also possible? Yeah.
Yes, it's possible. If you don't receive any additional instructions to go up from the 15-minute market instruction in the real time, then you might not have any real-time instructions to be paid the real-time price at.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, or it could be day ahead price only.
Oh.
Now, in the context of this slide, I do want to point out that this is a WEIM participant example, and so the base schedule, or the reason why this resource was going to be providing 70 megawatts, was not determined through a day-ahead market that is controlled by the ISO. And so the settlement for the 70 megawatts of base schedule does not take place in the ISO market in the current WEIM construct. The base schedule megawatts are not paid for through the ISO market, only the imbalances above or below that base schedule. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay, absolutely.
We do have one additional question, although I believe this might be a question for Bonnie. Samantha wants to know where she can access the June recording.
We can also provide a link to that. It's on the Western EIM website under, I think, Body of State Regulators. It's kind of a menu structure that you have to traverse through, but it is on the Western EIM website. So what I could do is, at the end of this session, as a follow-up, we'll have a survey that we send out to you. So in that survey, Rochelle, if you wouldn't mind helping me make a note to make sure that we send a link to the June recording, I will send that out. I'll actually need to pass that through Bonnie to everybody, because I realized, oh, I don't have everybody's email addresses. But I will get that information to Bonnie, the survey and also the link that should be included. So we'll make sure that we pass that along.
I was also just going to forward the slides too. So we'll make sure, I'll send out an email to all the participants today with all of this information for you all.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. All right, and I see, I'm reading in the chat, I see a note that says, what does the FMM and RTD stand for? So FMM stands for the 15-minute market, and RTD is the real-time dispatch, or also the 5-minute market, is what you might have heard it referred to as. So this example here for WEIM, the megawatts that are awarded get paid for, the economic bids get paid for at the real-time price. And as we discussed, it could be if you're instructed to move up from your base schedule in the 15-minute market interval, that it be at the 15-minute market price, or when you're if you're instructed to move up in the real-time dispatch, it would be at the real-time price, and it could be a collection of all of the above. Before I move on to the next example about the variable energy resource, I wanted to see if anybody had any questions about the WEIM example.
One question in the chat, Rada, so I guess the question is, can WEIM only participate in the real-time market currently?
That's correct. Right now, WEIM is only real-time market. There is that EDAM process where it's talking about the extension of the day-ahead market, and when that occurs, would be opening up the day-ahead market to the WEIM footprint. All right, I'm going to move to the variable energy resource example. So here, I wanted to wait for this part to talk about the difference in the way the forecast is treated in day ahead and real time, so that we could have it here in context for the example that we're going to go through. In the day ahead market, there will be a variable energy resource. There may be a forecasted output associated with that resource, but because it is so far in advance, the forecast is treated as advisory. And so the market does not consider the forecast when it is either awarding or optimizing that resource across that 24 hours. So the implication there is, if I submit a bid for my solar resource for 100 megawatts in hour ending 4, it's possible the sun's not shining yet, right, at 4 o'clock in the morning, and my forecast could say 0, but if I actually submit a bid for that resource for hour ending 4, the market could award that resource and have me on the hook for that, because it doesn't do anything with that forecast to determine whether or not it's feasible. It's too far in advance. The forecast is considered to just be advisory. So for a variable energy resource, you need to be thoughtful about the hours that you are bidding into. And when you're bidding into the day ahead market, understand that you are going to expect it to be settled at or settled for all of those megawatts that you were awarded, whether or not your resource has actually provided them and whether or not your resource is actually able to based on the forecast. So I'm not saying that people are doing that. Nobody's submitting into, hour ending 4 when the sun's not shining, but the point is just to say that the forecast does not play a part in the market results that are awarded. However, when we get to real time, the market does look at what the forecast is for that resource, and depending on whether you are self-scheduling that resource or submitting economic bids for that resource, it will use the forecasted output to either cap or extend the market award for that resource. So another point here to make from a real-time bidding example perspective is that when I submit a bid in real time, my bid follows a very specific curve, and it will go up to a certain amount of megawatts. The way the market interprets the bid curve from a variable energy resource, and only from a variable energy resource, is that even if my bid curve ends at, say, 80 megawatts, but the Pmax of my resource is actually 100, the market assumes that my economic bid extends fully to the Pmax of my resource, essentially saying, if my forecast says I can give you all of it, then my bid actually truly does extend at the end to encompass all of that resource. Like I said, this is only for variable energy resources. You don't have to necessarily bid all the way up to your full Pmax economically in real time, because you have a forecast that will feed your forecast data to the market, which the market will then use to adjust what your market award is. So in real time, if I'm submitting a self-schedule, then the market will default to whatever the forecasted amount is. So let's say I have a self-schedule of 50 megawatts, but I have a forecast of 70. The market will default and it will increase my self-schedule from 50 to 70, what my forecast value is. If I'm submitting this resource economically, I have a bid curve that gives an economic signal to the market, and the market will use that economic signal to actually increase or to cap off the amount of megawatts that I get awarded, even if I'm forecasted to be able to provide more. So I'll show you what an example looks like, and then we'll actually walk through together a little bit of a calculation, maybe a little bit higher level of difficulty, but it's the only one like this, and then we'll kind of end it off. So I'm going to give you a visual. This is a real-time bidding activity. This resource has a P-min of 0, it has a P-max of 100, and it's submitted a self-schedule of 70 megawatts. For that particular interval, there is a forecast of 90 megawatts. So what the market will do is extend or increase that self-schedule to the quantity that matches their forecast. So they will be awarded and dispatched for 90 megawatts, even though they only had a self-schedule of, 70. Any questions here?
One question in the chat, is the forecast verified or sense checked in any way? Or does it even matter given it's just advisory?
The advisory is in the day ahead perspective. The forecast can either be that I wouldn't say that there's a sanity check that's done on it from the perspective of the forecasting tool, but there is kind of like an extensive process where there is a certain amount of historical data that gets fed into the creation of that forecast. So the forecast for a variable energy resource can either come from the ISO forecasting service or provided by the entity itself. But part of that process, maybe actually I should restate what I said. All of that historical data that needs to be provided when shaping a forecast is really, I think, the sanity check that occurs. So it's kind of built into the forecasting process to have historical data on that resource so that there is a certain level of accuracy. So actually that there is some sort of sanity check that's built in. But from a day ahead perspective, the forecast is just advisory, so it's not considered. But in real time, that forecast is being used to drive the market results. And yes, there is that process where a certain amount of historical data, I think it's either 30 or 45 days of historical data, needs to be provided on a resource so that it can actually start using a forecast to drive its market awards. So yes, there's actually kind of a sanity check or a quality check built into the process before we will actually allow a resource to have its dispatches controlled by the forecast amount. And the forecast can either be provided by the ISO or by the WEIM market participant that you can choose how you want to have that forecasting take place. So that was the example. Now I have an exercise to go through. And like I said, there's a little bit of calculations that go into this exercise, but I wanted to do it so that we can talk through this here. And we'll do it together because I don't expect everybody to do a bunch of math necessarily, but I wanted just to show you how this works. And I'm going to actually, for myself, put the answers up over here on the right so that I make sure I'm giving you accurate information. So one thing that I wanted to point out when we're looking at an ISO bid curve is that you read down the left column for the megawatt quantity and up to the right for the price. We kind of talked about that when we were talking about batteries. So let's start at the top here. The goal of this is we're going to kind of talk through each line together and figure out what the market award was given the bid, look looking at the forecast and also what the prices were to try to figure out how the market would have awarded this resource. So my resource has a P-min of 0 and a P-max of 100. And we're going to feed this forecast data for hour ending 7, 8, 9, and 10 into the calculations. So when we're looking at this bid curve here, what we're saying is from 0 megawatts to 30, that price needs to be at least negative $15 for me to want to generate. From 30 to 50 megawatts, that price needs to be at least $5. And if I want to provide you from 50 to 60, that price needs to be at least $10. And also remember that even though I tapped off my bid curve at 60, because I'm a variable energy resource, the market will interpret this as saying 60 or the full P-max of my resource, you can dispatch me to if the price is at least $10. So we're going to, based on that information, we're going to look at some prices here. I'll keep that on the screen. And we're going to kind of work through this together to figure out in each one of these hours what that market award would be. So for hour ending 7, the LMP is negative $10. The forecasted megawatts is 20. And if we look at the bid curve, we're going to say, we said, this resource has bid in from 0 up to 30 megawatts if the price is at least negative $15. So based on that slice of the bid curve, what do you think the expected market award in megawatts would be for hour ending 7? Does anybody want to take a guess? And if you can put, you can either put it out verbally or you can put an answer in the chat. Let me open up the chat window again so I can see it. Does anybody want to venture a guess as to what the market award would be for this hour? I see Cameron has 20, so that's correct here. So we're saying the price needs to be at least negative $15, which, because in the negative $10 is actually more than negative 15. So we're going to say 20 megawatts awarded in that particular hour, hour ending 7. Mariah and Cameron, you both have that correct. Now, what about hour ending 8? The forecast says 45 megawatts. The LMP is $4. So what do you think the expected market award would be in this particular case? Does anybody have any guesses? I've got from Cameron and Jason, I've got 30. Does anybody want to volunteer an answer as to why we picked 30, even though the forecast was 45? You want to take yourself off of mute maybe and talk through your thought process on that for the group? Putting you on the spot.
This is Jason. Our bid for 30 at $5 wasn't reached. So we were kind of capped at 30.
That's correct.
And it's so, $4 higher than 15, right? Or negative 15. So.
Right. So if we're reading this slice of the bid curve, right, we said, if you want to take me from 30 to 50, that price needs to be at least $5. But here the price was only $4. So we were expecting that the market would cap it at 30. Because we were willing to go up to 30 if the price was at least negative 15, but we wanted it to be at least 5 to go above 30 essentially, right? So we're going to put in 30 there. So you've got that correct. What about hour ending 9? The LMP is $12. The forecast is 70. What is our expected market award here? I see Keisha and Cameron putting in 70, and that is correct, and Josh as well. Oops, I typed 40, I didn't mean to. So in this example, if you recall, I said that the market will look at your bid curve. In this case, we said, if you want to take me from 50 to 60, that price needs to be at least $10. The market will look at the way you capped off your bid curve at 60, but think that it also extends to the full Pmax of your resource, so 100. So anything from 50 to 100 will be treated as, or will be analyzed and fit into that 10 megawatt or $10 category. So anything to move me from 50 to my full value of my Pmax, if my forecast will allow it, will be at that $10. And then hour ending 10, the price is negative $30. The forecast is 90 megawatts. What do you expect a market award would be here? And if anybody wants to maybe give a why along with that as well, you can put that in the chat there too. Any thoughts on hour ending 10? Price is negative 30. Yeah, we've got an answer there from Keisha, 0. And it doesn't mean the minimum bid, which is why, and Cameron has it in there as well. Keisha's example and explanation, and Cameron as well. Negative 30 is less than negative 15. And we said, if you want to take me from 0 to 30, that price needs to be at least negative $15. And negative 30 is not that. So they're not going to be awarded at all. So it looks like you gathered that through this example, and I'm glad we could work through that with you. My understanding is that there will be additional examples that you'll be going through with the Stanford team. I don't know exactly what they look like, but I do know that they're going to be talking about the use of variable energy resources, both in the day ahead and perhaps real-time time frame as well. Actually, I think all the examples are day ahead. So keeping in mind that the day-ahead market awards become real-time schedules that you can then layer economic bids on top of would be probably good to know for your examples that you're going to go through with them about the variable energy resources. So with that said, does anybody have any questions about variable energy resources and how they participate in the ISO market?
I don't see any questions in the chat, Rada, or any hands up.
All right. So that was our last exercise to go through, and we kind of talked through it together, and I think it's good to do that way, a line at a time, so we get that knowledge and are able to apply it in a variety of examples. The last piece here to kind of round out the hour is really just to talk about other potential market outcomes and give you an opportunity to ask any additional questions. And what I mean by other potential market outcomes is, in each one of these examples, in order for us to talk about it and follow it through to real time and see what might occur, we had the market bids be accepted or partially accepted. There are some other things that might occur that I wanted to talk you through. So first, I'm going to fill this in here. From a market perspective, you can be awarded in day ahead for 3 different types of things: energy, ancillary services, and also residual unit commitment. If you're awarded for ancillary services or for RUC, you submit real-time energy bids to go along with those day ahead awards for capacity. In real time, those awards can be for energy, for ancillary services, or something called the flexible ramping product, which we haven't discussed in this session, but I believe is included in the recording of the June session, another real-time product that is available today, currently, both in the ISO BA and also for the WEIM participants as well. So those are the different types of awards that can come out of both the day ahead and the real time. Another thing that might happen is that you could not have your not be awarded as expected. So unexpected outcomes might be, I'm awarded below my bid price. We talked about that when we did the battery example, when we had a couple of hours where they said the price needs to be, I think it was $1.01 or less, and the price was actually $2 to charge that resource. It's possible that in that situation, either with a battery or with other resources, that there may be hours that you're awarded below your bid price. And that could be because the market needs that resource in that particular hour, or because they're positioning that resource, if you're a battery resource, to be charged going into future hours as well. You could also have a situation where you are partially awarded. So we had that with an example of the supplier. They offered a certain amount of megawatts as a self-schedule. They offered more megawatts in for economic bids. They had ancillary services bids. They had bids for RUC. Going out of day ahead into real time, they were not fully committed for the entire PMAX of that resource. So they could have partial market awards. And it's also possible that they could have no award at all. And in a situation where a resource does not receive a market award, it could be for a variety of reasons. It could be that, according to the market, that resource is currently on outage. There may be either a miscommunication between the folks managing the outages and the folks submitting bids, not knowing that the resource's outage had been extended and is therefore not available. When the ISO market analyzes the bids that are submitted, the bidding tool looks to make sure that the bid meets the parameters for the resource that we have in our database called the master file. So is the resource capable of providing the amount of megawatts it is offering currently based on what we know about that resource's parameters? The bidding tool doesn't check to see whether that resource is on an outage or not. That comes later. So when the market engine runs all of this information together, it has the bids, it has information about what resources are on outage. So it could be that the market has bids for a resource that is still out. It's never going to award a resource that is still out megawatts. That doesn't happen. So it could be that your resource is on outage. It could be that the on time for your resource exceeds what we call the planning horizon. So in the day ahead market, we look at the full 24 hours to optimize the use of that resource. In the real-time market, the short-term unit commitment process looks out only 4.5 hours. If the minimum on time for your resource is, say, 8 hours, for example, the real-time market isn't going to start that resource up because it has to be on for 8 hours, but we can only see as far as 4.5 to 5 hours out. So that resource would have to come into the market, not with an economic bid like that, but with a self-schedule to say, I'm going to be on at this particular megawatt quantity at this time, so that the market would then pick it up in real time and be able to provide additional awards. Or that resource needs to be bidding into the day ahead market so that can be fully optimized across that 24-hour period. Another reason, that your resource might not be picked up is that your commitment costs are too high. So when the market analyzes the bids that are submitted by the resources, it also takes a look at the commitment costs. How much does it cost to start up this resource and have it running at minimum load? So it's not just the bid price that is analyzed when you're submitting bids, but also how much it costs to start the resource up and have them running at min load. It could be that those are too expensive, and that is why a different, more economical resource was selected. And it could be a variety of other situations. And in that case, I would say that there's a bunch of things that might occur, such as mismatch in the data that we have in our systems versus theirs, or a resource had been derated to a specific megawatt quantity, which is similar to an outage, like not fully out, but running at lower capacity and maybe not able to be dispatched into a higher range. It could be that someone has the impression that the commitment costs for both of these resources are the same. They're side by side. They're wondering why one got selected over the other, but it could be that maybe Pmax values are different, which cause the calculation for the startup and min load costs to be slightly different. So there's a lot of different nuances to the reason why, hey, how come my resource wasn't awarded? But those are some possible examples. So the next thing here is I wanted to go over just a little bit of opportunity for you to provide us with maybe some takeaways that you got from this session. If you can put in the chat pod something you learned or something you're taking away from this session, we'll do that for like a minute or two, and then we'll give you an opportunity to, I'll send out a survey to you along with the email that Bonnie will send to you, and we'll give you an opportunity to ask some questions. So if you wouldn't mind for a moment, taking a moment to think about the session that we just had and maybe any points that you're taking away from the discussion, you can go ahead and put that into the chat section, and I'll give you a moment to do that. Thank you, Keisha. So capacity awards from the day ahead market need to be rebid as energy into the real-time market. Thank you for that. If there's anything else that folks would like to share, feel free to put that in the chat there. Not a lot of answers following. I know that I kind of flooded you with a lot of information, so if you need a moment to marinate on that, that's perfectly understandable. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide here. Like I said, I'm going to give you a link to a survey in an email that we send through Bonnie, and then give you an opportunity to ask any, use the last couple of minutes here to ask any questions that you might have based on anything that we talked about so far. So what questions do you have for me?
We do have a question in the chat asking how often is the VERV forecast updated?
So the forecast information is updated. It looks out 2.5 hours, but it's updated every 5 minutes. So that information is fed continuously into each one of the market processes that are running.
Thanks, Rada. Keisha, let me know if you have any follow-ups or if that is good. We have a question from Josh. Are the presentation slides on the KISA website?
Bonnie, I think they're on either the Western EIM website or the website for Weave. I'm not sure where they ended up being.
Yeah, so they're not posted as of now on the website, on the BOSR website, but again, we'll go ahead and send you all an email with the PowerPoint or the presentation, and then we'll also look to posting it maybe on the BOSR website, but for sure we'll send you all a copy of these slides in a few minutes. So.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. Yeah, I'll get you a link to that survey very quickly as well. So that can be all included together. Thank you.
Rada, we do have a hand. Keisha, I see that your hand is up. Go ahead and ask your question. Oh, maybe it was an accidental hand. It might have been. I think we're good.
All right. Well, yeah, we'll be here for another minute here while you're thinking to give you an opportunity to ask any questions. But while we're at it, I want to just thank you very much for all of your questions throughout the session. I think it was a really good session where a lot of chat questions and interactivity, and I appreciate you working through these exercises with me. I hope that you found the information that we shared today helpful for you and informative. And I'm going to go ahead and hit pause on the recording, and let's see. Oh, before we do that, checking back with Keisha. It seems like your audio didn't work. Do we have a question that we wanted to get to, or are we good? All right, it looks like we're good to go. All right, thanks, folks. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording here, and I appreciate you participating, and thank you so much.
And just as a